The knock on the cabin door came just after sunrise, sharp and deliberate, the kind of knock that carries purpose, not hesitation. I wasn't expecting anyone. Out here in the quiet stretch of pines and mist where the world still smelled of sap and damp earth, visitors were rare. I pulled back the curtain, half expecting to see my neighbor, or maybe the UPS guy who sometimes got lost on these back roads. But what I saw was a man in a crisp jacket holding a clipboard, a leather folder tucked under his arm. He wasn't from around here. I opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you?" He smiled, professional and polished. "Good morning. I'm here for the showing." The words didn't make sense at first, not in the slow rhythm of my mountain mornings. "Showing? Showing what?" "Excuse me?" I asked. "The showing," he repeated, flipping through the papers on his clipboard. "This is the property at 114 Pine Hollow, correct? The cabin listed through the HOA. My clients will be arriving shortly for a tour." I froze, my hand still on the doorknob. "No," I said slowly, deliberately. "This property isn't listed for sale. This cabin is mine." The man blinked, clearly thrown off. He checked his papers again, tapped at his phone, and frowned. "Well, the HOA sent me the listing information. I was told the cabin was available immediately." The chill in the air seeped through my bones, but it wasn't the weather. It was anger. This cabin wasn't just a house. It was history. My father built it by hand, one log at a time, before I was even born. It was where he taught me how to cast a line into the creek that wound like a silver thread behind the trees. Where I split my first piece of firewood with his old axe. Where we'd sit in silence on winter nights. Just the crackle of the fire between us. Every scar on the wood floors, every creak in the rafters carried his fingerprints. And now this stranger was standing here, clipboard in hand, acting like it was just another box to sell and move on. "Listen," I said, my voice low but firm. "This cabin isn't for sale. No one has permission to list it. And you need to leave." The realtor raised his hand slightly like he didn't want trouble. "I understand, sir. I'm just going off the information I was given. The HOA told me the property was being made available. If there's been a miscommunication, maybe you should take it up with them. I'm only doing my job." My jaw clenched. The HOA, of course. For months they'd been tightening their grip, sending notices about improper fencing and excessive wood piles, as if the wilderness cared about their suburban rules. They'd threatened fines, inspections, and endless citations. I'd ignored most of them. I lived here long before they expanded their little kingdom and started enforcing their ridiculous bylaws. My cabin was outside their jurisdiction, and I'd made that clear more than once. But apparently that wasn't enough. Now they were trying to sell my home out from under me. "I'll handle the HOA," I said finally, my voice like ice. "But there will be no showing today. Not tomorrow, not ever. This property is not for sale." The realtor nodded, clearly uncomfortable, and started backing away. "All right. I'll inform my clients when they arrive. I apologize for the misunderstanding." I shut the door before he could say anything else, my pulse pounding in my ears. I leaned against the wooden frame, staring at the floorboards that my father's boots once scuffed. This wasn't just some administrative mistake. This was deliberate. The HOA wanted me gone, and they were willing to play dirty to make it happen. A half hour later, I watched from the window as a sleek black SUV rolled up the gravel road. A couple stepped out. City types, judging by their tailored coats and polished shoes. They looked around with curiosity, pointing at the trees, the porch, even the chimney, as though they already imagined themselves living here. The realtor met them near the gate and shook his head, gesturing toward the cabin. Their faces fell when he explained, and after a few tense words, the couple got back in their car and drove off, tires spitting gravel. The realtor lingered a moment, looking back at the cabin, then shook his head and left too. I stood there, fists clenched at my sides, watching until their cars disappeared into the forest road. The silence afterward felt heavier than usual, pressing in like the weight of the whole forest. I knew this wasn't the end. The HOA had crossed a line, and if I didn't act, they'd try again. They weren't just after my compliance anymore. They were after my home. That night I sat at the old pine table with a cup of black coffee gone cold. The stack of HOA letters lay spread out before me like a trail of breadcrumbs leading to their scheme. Every citation, every notice, every thinly veiled threat, they'd been building toward this. They wanted to wear me down, to force me out. Maybe they thought I was just some stubborn old holdout they could bully until I caved. They didn't understand who they were dealing with. This cabin wasn't a piece of real estate to me. It was the last piece of my father I had left. The night he passed, I swore I'd protect it, keep it standing against time and weather and anything else that tried to take it. And now the HOA thought they could invite some realtor to parade strangers through my home like it was theirs to sell. I felt the anger coil tight in my chest, not wild and reckless, but sharp and cold. They wanted a fight? Fine. They'd get one. The next morning, I loaded heavy steel chains into the back of my truck along with the biggest padlock I owned. The sun hadn't fully climbed over the trees yet, and mist still curled low over the creek, but I didn't care. I drove straight down to the gate at the edge of my property, wrapped the chains through the bars, and locked it tight. Then I pulled out a weathered plank of wood, painted the words in bold black letters that no one could miss. Private property. Not for sale. Trespassers will be prosecuted. I mounted it right where the HOA had staked their shiny for sale sign, driving the nails in with every ounce of force I had. Each strike of the hammer was like a promise. This is mine, and no one takes it from me. As I stepped back to look at the sign, the morning sun finally broke through the trees, setting the letters aglow. For the first time in days, I felt calm, not because the fight was over, but because I knew I was ready for it. The HOA thought they could steamroll me, but they were about to learn the hard way. Some gates don't open, some cabins aren't for sale, and some people don't back down. The gate was the first line of defense. That morning I spent hours fortifying it, threading the heavy chain through the iron bars again and again until it clanged like armor. When I snapped the padlock shut, it echoed with finality. No car was coming through without my say-so. I ran my hand over the cold steel, the way a soldier might check his rifle before battle. This wasn't just a precaution, it was a message. By the time the sun crept overhead, the fresh sign stood tall beside the locked gate. The plank of wood I'd painted wasn't pretty. Drips of black paint streaked across the surface, but the words were bold. Impossible to ignore. Private property, not for sale. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Each letter was jagged and raw, carved with my anger, painted with my resolve. It wasn't a decoration. It was a warning carved straight from my will. I walked back up the gravel drive, boots crunching on the stones, and climbed onto the porch. From there I could see the gate clearly, framed by pine branches that swayed in the wind. I settled into the old rocking chair, set my coffee mug on the armrest, and waited. It didn't take long. By mid-afternoon, the realtor returned. I spotted the same shiny sedan easing down the road, headlights cutting through the trees even though the day was bright. Behind him was another car, sleek and spotless, the kind city folks drove when they wanted to look important. They stopped in front of the gate, and I watched from my porch as doors swung open. Out stepped the realtor, trying to keep his composure, and behind him came a couple, maybe in their late 30s, dressed like they'd walked straight out of a lifestyle magazine. The woman wore leather boots that had never seen mud in their lives. The man adjusted his scarf as though the forest air was too much for him. They looked around with the kind of curiosity people reserve for museum exhibits, not homes. To them, this was a commodity, an escape, something they could buy, polish, and brag about. The realtor gestured toward the cabin, his words lost on the wind, but I could imagine the script. Beautiful log home, rustic charm, lots of potential. He waved toward the creek, the trees, the porch where I sat. Then he pointed at the gate and the sign. His tone shifted, and I saw the couple's smiles fade. The woman frowned, crossed her arms. The man shook his head, clearly irritated. They exchanged words with the realtor, who was already sweating. Finally, all three turned to look up the driveway toward me. I raised my coffee mug in a slow, deliberate salute, leaned back in my chair, and gave them the faintest smirk. Even from a distance, I could see their faces tighten. The couple muttered something sharp, spun on their heels, and marched back to their car. The SUV roared to life, spitting gravel as they reversed too fast, tires kicking dust into the air. They were gone as quickly as they came. The realtor lingered, pacing near the gate, phone in his hand. He stared up the driveway again, but I didn't move. I just rocked back and forth, the steady creak of wood the only answer I gave him. Finally, he shook his head, defeated, and climbed back into his car. Both vehicles disappeared down the winding road, swallowed by the forest. I exhaled, long and slow. It felt good, better than I'd expected. I hadn't just kept them out, I'd made a statement. This cabin wasn't theirs to buy, sell, or trade. And if the HOA wanted to test me, They were going to find out exactly how immovable I could be. That night, as the fire snapped in the stone hearth, I thought about the couple's faces. They hadn't just looked disappointed, they'd looked embarrassed. The HOA had promised them something shiny, something easy. Instead, they'd been confronted by reality, a locked gate, a warning sign, and a man who wasn't going anywhere. I could almost hear them complaining on the ride back to the city, swearing they'd never waste their time again. The realtor, though, he was another matter. He'd looked rattled, not just inconvenienced. His reputation had taken a hit. Realtors thrived on trust, on being the bridge between clients and dreams. The HOA had handed him rotten planks, and when he'd tried to walk across, he'd fallen straight through. He wouldn't forgive them for that. Which meant the cracks in their scheme were already spreading. But the HOA itself, I knew they wouldn't stop. They'd come back, because that's what bullies do. They push until you push back harder, and that was fine by me. The next morning, I walked down to the gate again. The sign stood untouched, the chain still locked tight. A squirrel darted across the road, and the forest hummed with the quiet sounds of life that city people never noticed. I took it all in. The scent of pine sap, the crisp air, the damp earth after last night's dew. This was home. My father's cabin. My cabin. No HOA letter, no realtor's pitch, no slick couple's money could ever change that. By midweek, another car tried to pull up. This one wasn't a realtor, just a curious looky-loo who'd seen the online listing before it was taken down. They slowed at the gate, rolled down the window, squinted at the sign, and then drove off without even bothering to turn around. The chains had done their job. The sign had done its job. My message was spreading. Still, I wasn't naive. The HOA wouldn't simply walk away. They'd be angry, embarrassed, maybe even humiliated that I'd turned their little game into a public spectacle. Word would get back to them that potential buyers had been scared off, that the realtor had been left standing at a locked gate like a fool, that their plan had blown up in their faces. And I knew what that meant. They'd come at me harder. That night I sharpened my axe not because I expected a fight, but because it grounded me. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filled the cabin, steady and deliberate. It reminded me of when my father used to sit by the fire, honing his tools while telling me that some battles were fought with strength, others with patience, but the most important ones were fought with resolve. He always said, a man who knows what he's willing to stand for will never fall. As sparks from the fireplace flickered against the log walls, I realized I wasn't just defending a piece of land. I was defending a promise to him, to myself, to the life we'd built here. The HOA thought they could bully me into submission, that they could erase history with paperwork and arrogance, but they'd underestimated something far stronger than their bylaws: my refusal to bend. When I stepped out onto the porch the next morning, frost glistening on the railing, I felt it in my bones. The gate wasn't just a barrier anymore. It was a line in the sand. And behind that line I stood ready, coffee in hand, eyes on the road, waiting for the next move. Because one thing was certain: the HOA had just picked a fight with the wrong man, and I was only getting started. A week later, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel again, but this time it wasn't a realtor or some hopeful couple. It was the HOA president himself. His white SUV came rolling down the road like he owned it, windows tinted, chrome polished, the kind of car that looked ridiculous covered in dust from these back roads. He parked just beyond the gate and stepped out, slamming the door harder than he needed to. He was dressed in his usual uniform, pressed khakis, collared shirt tucked tight, clipboard in one hand like it was a weapon. His face was already red, his jaw tight, and even from the porch I could see the vein pulsing in his temple. He marched up to the gate, yanking at the chains like a man trying to break into his own prison. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, pointing at the sign I'd put up. His voice carried through the trees, loud enough to spook a pair of birds from the branches overhead. I stayed where I was, sitting on the porch with my coffee. I didn't rush, didn't raise my voice. I just looked down at him calmly, letting the silence stretch until it became heavy. Finally, I said, "That's my property, my gate, my sign. What does it look like?" His face darkened, and he shook the clipboard in the air like it was a gavel. "This is unacceptable. You can't lock off the road, you can't deface community property, and you sure as hell can't threaten prospective buyers. I'll have you fined for this. I'll have you sued. The HOA will not tolerate." I stood slowly, set my coffee down on the railing, and walked to the edge of the porch. The HOA, I cut him off, doesn't own this land. You don't own this cabin. You don't get to list what doesn't belong to you. And if you think for 1 second that I'll let you, you're even dumber than I thought. His mouth opened and closed, his bluster faltering for a second. But then he straightened his shoulders, trying to regain control. You think you're clever, don't you? Hiding behind your chains and your signs. But this community has rules and no one is above them. Not even you. That was when I reached behind me and pulled the envelope from the porch railing. It was thick, stuffed with glossy photos and neatly folded papers. I held it up so he could see it, then tossed it down into the dirt on his side of the gate. The envelope split open, spilling its contents across the ground. He bent down, confused, picking up the first photo. His eyes narrowed. It was a shot of the illegal shed he'd built behind his own house, a rickety structure that violated at least 3 of the HOA's own bylaws. The next photo was his unpermitted home extension, jutting awkwardly off the back of his property like an afterthought. Then came the pictures of his boat, parked squarely where community rules forbade it, blocking fire access lanes. Page after page, photo after photo, all of it laid bare. Proof of his hypocrisy, his arrogance, his corruption. His face drained of color as he flipped through them, his hands trembling slightly though he tried to hide it. I've been patient, I said, my voice low but steady. I've tolerated your letters, your threats, your harassment. I ignored your petty little citations because I figured eventually you'd get bored and move on. But then you crossed the line. You tried to sell my father's cabin out from under me. You brought strangers here, paraded them through my land like it was yours to offer. That ends now. He looked up at me, his lips parted, but no words came out. His eyes darted from the photos back to my face, searching for any sign of weakness. I gave him none. You try this again, I continued, and those photos go straight to the county. I'm sure they'll love to know their HOA president has been breaking the very rules he forces everyone else to follow. Maybe they'll fine you. Maybe they'll shut you down. Maybe they'll sue you for a change. Whatever happens, it'll be your problem, not mine. For the first time since I'd known him, the man looked small. Not physically. He was still broad, still standing tall on the other side of the gate. But something in his presence had shriveled. The arrogance had drained out of him, leaving only fear. You wouldn't dare, he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. I leaned on the porch railing, met his gaze, and said, "Try me." The silence stretched between us, thick as the forest air. Finally, he stuffed the photos back into the envelope with shaking hands, crumpling the papers in his rush. He didn't look at me again. He just turned, stormed back to his SUV, and slammed the door. The engine roared to life, tires spinning on the gravel as he tore down the road faster than was safe. I watched until the sound of his car faded into the orm,